Gracefully Graying. I'm your host, Attorney Henry Gornbein. Today on Gracefully Graying, I am very pleased to welcome Rabbi Joshua Bennett of Temple Israel, which is the largest Reform congregation in the world, as we discuss some of the Jewish traditions regarding death and grieving. Rabbi Bennett, welcome to Gracefully Graying.
Thank you very much. It's great to be back on the show and to have this time with you.
I appreciate the time. I know you're very busy, and I really appreciate the time on your schedule. First of all, why don't you tell our viewers a little bit about your role when you are helping someone with a terminal illness?
So the tradition in Judaism is very clear that the most important thing in our world, in our human existence, is the preservation of life. That concept is given a Hebrew name, pikuach nefesh, or the saving of a life. And everything in Jewish tradition is geared towards that value, driven towards that value. So when we work with a family who is dealing with a family member, friend, who is in a moment of crisis, nearing the end of life, or in a terminal illness, there is a tension between wanting to save a life and wanting to preserve dignity at the end of life. And so the conversations typically edge around those two subjects. On the one hand, how can we preserve somebody's life and to make sure that the quality of life that they're experiencing is a good one? And at the same time, recognizing that we are all part of this cycle that brings us through life and eventually brings us to death. And how can we adequately support them through those challenging moments?
Is there sometimes conflict when you're dealing with family members, with some wanting to do everything possible to prolong life and others saying, let's realize the end is there and help someone ease the suffering and transist into whatever that comes next?
Certainly. There is no guarantee that everybody in a family is in the same place in their process of acceptance, including the person who is themselves suffering a terminal illness. I believe that everybody goes through a process of grieving, essentially, even before a death happens. And it's during those hours or days or months that we support people through those challenging decision-making processes. Thankfully, the Detroit Jewish community has a Jewish hospice and chaplaincy agency or network that is very, very helpful in negotiating those muddy waters. And at Temple Israel, we are lucky to have Rabbi Jennifer Kaluzny on our team, who is also associated with the Jewish chaplaincy and hospice network, who helps us negotiate that time.
What advice would you give when a loved one is about to pass away?
So from a ritual standpoint, we encourage people to engage in prayer, whether that prayer is simply personal, experiential prayer with family and loved ones, or if it is going to, for example, saying the Shema, which is traditionally something that we offer at the end of life. Having a ritual moment, having time together as a family, holding hands, sitting around the bedside, and reciting a prayer that's familiar to everybody, often I find brings comfort. But it also is something that can be done without a specifically ritual prayer, at least in the Reform movement of Judaism and liberal Judaism. So I often encourage people to, for example, meet one-on-one with the person who is at the end of life and give permission for the transfer from life to death. Oftentimes I find two realities. One is that a person is waiting for family members to arrive and to have that conversation to make sure things are in order. And the other is I find sometimes people wait for those conversations to be complete and for people to leave so that they then give themselves the permission to end life. Obviously, this is something that we are not in control of in this world, but I do find patterns that repeat over and over again in terms of people having that chance to offer a final goodbye and permission to leave this universe, this world, and other people at the end of life who wait for people to be out of their room. Jokingly, I sometimes encourage people who've been with a loved one for many, many hours or days prior to their death to just go out for a few minutes, take a break for lunch, take a break for a meal. And often in that moment, the person ends their life.
Rabbi Josh, tell us about a typical Jewish funeral service.
So the Jewish mourning process is bigger than just the funeral itself. The mourning process, as we've described, starts as people are preparing for that moment. But at the moment of death, there are many rituals that have evolved over time. In its most ancient form, the Jewish community rends a garment at the moment of hearing of a loved one's death. And in the ancient world, that was literally the tearing of one's clothing in that moment of sadness. That has evolved over time to what we refer to as Kriya ribbons. The Kriya ribbon is a symbolic ribbon that the loved one of someone who's passed away tears as a symbol of that gut-wrenching, physical, emotional moment of learning of a loved one's death. That moment is, in fact, the real beginning of the mourning process for somebody. So that's even before the funeral has begun. The funeral itself consists of a variety of prayers. There's a tradition of guarding a person who has died with the words of Jewish tradition. Often psalms are repeated by family and friends from the moment of death until the moment of the funeral service. But all of that is really intended to comfort those people who are going through the process of getting ready for a funeral. And then we enter into the actual funeral itself, which I'm happy to sort of guide you through depending on how you want to lead me here.
Well, why don't we start with how do you prepare for a eulogy, which is really one of the key moments of any funeral, no matter what the religion.
Right. So there is this ritual that has, again, evolved over time to remember a loved one who's died by sharing the story of their life. In American custom and tradition, it's the obituary that appears often in a newspaper or is sent to family and friends in the form of a letter or an email. That obituary in Jewish terminology is actually called the eulogy. The eulogy is a speech or a series of speeches that are intended to honor the life of a loved one. In concert with the spirit of what I began with, that Judaism is all about life, this is not about the death itself. It's not telling the story of the end of life, but rather honoring the story of the person's fullness of life. There are sometimes meetings with family, with a member of the clergy to tell those stories. I personally often believe that those meetings with families are more important than the funeral themselves. When we spend an hour together with a family, we hear longer versions of stories. We see laughter and tears. We hear a wide breadth of the experiences of a person. Then it's the job of the clergy person or family members to distill those hour or 2 hour conversations down into a 10 or 15-minute eulogy. For obvious reasons, it's impossible to characterize the entirety of a person's life in just a few minutes. So that longer period of time with a family is a chance to really honor and celebrate their life. But ultimately, when we get to the funeral, after opening prayers from Jewish tradition, psalms or other opening prayers, we would enter into the spirit of telling the story, the eulogy itself. Sometimes it's just a member of the clergy. Other times it's family members who want to share their stories as well. That is something that has just evolved with time. We sort of go back and forth in my career of nearly 3 decades, more and less family members willing or wanting to share their stories. But in any case, we use that time in the middle of the funeral service to honor that beautiful story of a human life.
Yeah, I agree. I think a eulogy is really a way of honoring someone's life. We all have our stories, we all have our lives, and it's important to honor that person as we memorialize them through the funeral service. So I've been involved in several eulogies myself, and I just think it's a beautiful way to send someone off, so to speak. What about I know that Jewish funerals seem to be shorter than most other religions. Is there a reason for that?
Well, so rather than talking about the reason for the difference, I will just suggest that in many other faith traditions, there is a full worship service that happens prior to any life cycle. And so often that gets convoluted with the actual funeral itself. So, for example, in other Catholic traditions, for example, at a wedding, there might be a full mass prior to the wedding, and it all gets lumped together. Similar things happen in other traditions with funerals. In Judaism, we're very starkly committed to that memorial process that begins with prayers, continues with eulogy, and then ends with what's known as El Maleh Rachamim, which is God full of mercy. It's a very traditional prayer that talks about God's connection to the soul level piece of our human existence. We give thanks to God for giving us our souls and for helping that soul to make its transition from this world to the next. That El Maleh prayer is actually spoken in certain some circumstances at the funeral home, also repeated at the cemetery. And then there's the question of the burial itself, which we should get to, because I want to talk a little bit in a moment about the words of Kaddish and where their placement happens and some of the differentials that we see in various parts of the Jewish community.
Before we get to the burial, there's a question, and that is, in Judaism, we bury the dead as quickly as possible. I think optimally within 24 to 48 hours. In other religions, often the funeral and burial will not be, sometimes for as long as a week or longer. What is the reason for that? And I know there's a interesting explanation that you can tell us.
Yeah, so this is a very simple explanation based on practicality. If you go back to the origins of the Abrahamic faiths, specifically Judaism and Islam, who are based in what's today's current Middle East, you know that the temperature, the climate in those regions is very hot and dry. And so the decomposition of bodies after death began very quickly. Because of that, because of some of the sanitation issues and disease issues that happen after death, the custom became to bury very quickly, because the body would already begin to change form in its decomposition phases in the heat and the dryness. Because of that, Jewish traditions specifically and other faith traditions from the Middle East tend to bury very quickly. Now, some of that changed over time with the advent of refrigeration. And so while the desire is still to bury very quickly from the standpoint of Jewish tradition, we are able to delay burials now because of refrigeration options, which allow us to, for example, wait for family members who are living far from the community who may be traveling home for a funeral. But the origins of that quick burial really do come from a practical reason of protecting the community from disease after the death.
Okay, we've talked about the funeral service, and the next step is really at the gravesite. So why don't you take us through what happens there? I know we have Kaddish, we have other rituals. Why don't you take us through those, Rabbi Josh?
So it's an interesting thing for us to talk about, because you mentioned that there's the funeral and then there's the graveside. The truth is, there is nothing demanding that a funeral takes place in a funeral home as opposed to at a gravesite. We actually, during COVID, were moved much more towards graveside burials because it kept people outside and out of proximity with one another. Now, there was a level of comfort of having a service where people could sit and be in an air-conditioned or heated indoor space for a eulogy, and then moving to the graveside. That's not necessary, though, in Jewish tradition. When you are at the graveside, though, whether it's a full service that takes place there or another end of the burial service that began at the funeral home or in a synagogue, there is really one job to be done, and that is to give our loved one or our friend a proper burial. So in Jewish tradition, the body returns to the earth from which it came, And so the burial happens, as you said, quickly. It also happens naturally. So in a Jewish traditional burial, the casket is fully decomposable, made of wood only, no metal, buried in the ground, directly in the earth, so that the body and the casket decomposes as quickly as possible and human life goes back to earth. That process can take various shapes and forms. In the modern society, many funeral homes and cemeteries require a concrete vault, which keeps the land a little bit more even on the top after the collapse of the framework of the casket. But that's not necessary. And in a very traditional Jewish burial, the casket is actually in the ground itself, or in a vault with a hole or holes in the bottom so that the earth can actually come. People are also buried in their casket with a bit of earth from Israel. And the idea behind that is that Jewish people all desire to be buried in Israel. And ultimately, when the Messiah comes, it will be sort of like a modern GPS to allow the Messiah, who's resurrecting bodies in Jewish tradition, to bring those bodies back to Jerusalem, where all of us will rise in the world to come. Now, that obviously is a mystical concept that has changed over time, but still to this day, most Jewish burials happen with a bit of earth from the land of Israel underneath the head of the person who's being buried.
I didn't know that. I learned something great. What about the placing of earth, that the mourners at the end of the funeral service will shovel earth on the casket? Tell us about that.
So as I mentioned, the whole goal here in a burial is to provide for somebody a proper burial, quick and proper burial, meaning fully buried, so that, for example, in the ancient world, grave robbers couldn't come, that somebody would live in peace in eternity. For that reason, actually burying somebody with our own hands becomes one of the ritual observances that many Jews like to participate in. What that means is, rather than letting others come and add earth to the grave, many Jewish members of the community will themselves take shovels and add either symbolically a bit of earth or do the entire burial. It is considered the last act of kindness that you can offer another human being, specifically because it's something that they will never be able to repay to you. So many people will remain at the graveside, either symbolically adding a bit of earth or doing the full burial until the earth is all the way up to the top or covering the casket. Now, there are a few rituals that I just want to quickly talk about. First of all, while it is an obligation to bury a friend or a loved one, it is not something that we are eager to do. So tradition says that we don't pass the shovel eagerly to the next person. You take a bit of earth, put it in the grave, and then the next person steps forward, you put the shovel back into the earth. Other people you might see take the backside of the shovel. A little bit harder to do that, shows a bit of hesitance. Also, a shovel is typically associated with growth, building, or planting. We use the shovel differently for a funeral. We use the backside to show that we are not participating in the usual or normal use of a shovel. This has new meaning. This is a little bit more spiritual. This is something we don't want to participate in, but it's something we are obligated to do.
What about Kaddish? Tell us about that.
Yeah, so finally, at the very end, and again, with every rabbi, with every part of Jewish tradition, there's a slightly different order of this. Some people will offer the words of Kaddish at the funeral home, others will do it before the actual burial, and still more traditional Jews will wait until the full burial is complete. But the final words of a funeral service are the words of Kaddish. The Kaddish is an ancient prayer written actually in Aramaic, not in Hebrew. Its origins are as a prayer for life and to honor teachers. And over time, that teacher's prayer becomes a prayer for deceased teachers, and then becomes a prayer applied to all deceased loved ones. It is praise of God for the gift of life. And the words of Kaddish end with Oseh Shalom Bimromav, O God, who has given us peace in the high heavens, allow that peace to descend on all of us. And together, everybody in the congregation will recite the word Amen, assenting to the spirit of that prayer as we send our loved one off into the next world.
Rabbi Josh, how does Judaism treat the issue of cremations? And you actually officiated on a service for a dear friend of mine who was cremated, and this was at Clover Hill, and there was a small portion of the cemetery that is now reserved for those who are cremated.
So I want to be clear. Traditional Jewish thought prohibits cremation. There are a few reasons for that, one of which is that we are to be buried as we are, so that when ultimately the Messiah does come and human life is resurrected, that we are together with our parts and our bodies. To that end, people who lose a limb early in life often will have that limb buried in the same burial plot where eventually they will lie. And that's, again, because we want to keep people's bodies together. For that reason, the destruction of the body, for example, cremation, was prohibited. Then, post-Holocaust, when so many Jewish bodies and others were burned by the Nazis, it was just another enforcement of that ancient law. So it became culturally inappropriate to burn a body when at the end of life. Having said that, there has been a modern movement over time for many people who believe that it is A, either less expensive, or B, more environmentally friendly, or C, just more in line with their personal spiritual thinking, that cremation makes more sense. And while the most traditional rabbis in Jewish communities will not accept those cremations, as you mentioned, many cemeteries, many liberal Jewish communities are beginning to think otherwise and allow for different availability of cremation. So, for example, I will officiate at cremation services, whereas other people in our community may not.
Tell us about Shiva. We've completed the funeral in Shiva, which is a very important part of the Jewish mourning process.
So we talked about the preparation, what happens before the funeral, the tearing of the ribbon, the meeting with a family and a rabbi to prepare for the funeral. We've talked about the funeral itself. And then there is the process of mourning that happens after the burial. And beginning in that moment, we enter into 3 phases of memorial, or 3 phases of ritual memory, of Yizkor. The first is Shiva, which literally translates to 7. It is an intense 7-day period of time where in a traditional family, there is the most intense version of mourning, daily prayer, family members greeting others who come to give them their condolences, and an intensity of mourning which would not allow for celebrations of any kind. In fact, Jewish tradition suggests that there should not be the mixture of joy and sadness. So in the event that Shiva is happening prior to a Jewish holiday, the Jewish holiday then ends Shiva and allows those people to go back into celebration mode. Now, there are a number of rituals around Shiva, but before we get to that, let me just lay out the whole plan. Shiva, 7 days, intense mourning. Then Shloshim, 30 days of less intense mourning, which is an early entry of family members back into the rest of the world, work and celebration and community. And then a full year, which is the full completion of a cycle. And at the end of that year, you have what's called Yartzeit, which is the anniversary of a death, which is then annually observed to remember. So 7 days, 30 days, and then the full year.
What are some Jewish views on eternity and life after death from your perspective, Rabbi Joshua? Probably a tough question.
We're diving deeply into the tough stuff. So let me say this. Literally, there is almost nothing that you could offer as a what happens after death that I would say has not been spoken of somewhere in Jewish tradition, with the exception perhaps of bodily resurrection. So the idea that Christianity has that humans are then resurrected in bodily form is just not something that finds itself in Jewish tradition. There are Jewish authors and scholars throughout history who have said nothing happens, we are buried and we go back to the earth and that's it. There are still others who talk about this world and the next world, a world to come. There are those who suggest our souls depart our body at the moment of death. In fact, there's a tradition you may have heard of. When a person dies, you open a window in the room where the person has died. That concept is not a law, but it's a custom, allowing the soul to exit and go elsewhere. Those who believe in the soul separating from the body might think of the soul going to the next world, whereas the body stays here in this world. Again, literally everything you could argue, you think is possible, has been spoken of. And the beautiful part about this conversation is because we really don't know, we can allow ourselves to believe what is comfortable for us as modern humans.
Very important. You really covered this topic beautifully, and it's a topic that people don't like to deal with, but it's so important, and I really appreciate it. Now, let me ask you a question. What do you find most challenging about your role of being a rabbi?
Are you asking specific to death and dying or just in general?
In general.
So it's interesting because I would suggest, while most people ask, how can you as a rabbi do funerals, be so engaged in those moments without becoming emotionally involved? The truth is, I would not say funerals are the most difficult part of my career. It's actually one of the most fulfilling and rewarding parts of my career because I move people, or I'm part of the process that moves people from the death to life again. And it's really important that Judaism, if you look at the ritual we talked about, does that. It moves us from the moment of death through intensity to less intensity and ultimately back to life, sustaining that concept of pikuach nefesh, that the value of human life is most important. So for me, funerals are actually wonderful. It's a strange thing to say. The far more difficult things that I encounter are moments of human struggle. You talked earlier about sickness, illness. Illness is a very challenging moment. Being with people in prayer, being with people when relationships are challenged, marital counseling. Those are really the hardest moments for me as a rabbi. And then lastly, I would just argue that the very significant changing of priorities in the Jewish community is something I fear for the future. What will Jewish institutions look like? Will we survive this generation? What has happened because of COVID? Those are the kinds of things that intellectually I struggle with right now.
Good questions. We can have another dialogue, but we're out of time. Rabbi Joshua Bennett from Temple Israel, I want to thank you so much for being our guest on Gracefully Graying. This is such an important topic that you cover so beautifully. And I want to thank our viewers for watching Gracefully Graying.